The cruelest thing a room full of strangers can steal isn't your seat. It's your dignity. Sophia Bennett had planned 218 weddings during the last 11 years, but at exactly 5:42 p.m. on a warm Saturday evening in downtown Chicago, she found herself standing alone beside a beautifully decorated reception table while every guest around her pretended she no longer existed. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across the ballroom. Fresh ivory roses climbed elegant arches, and a live string quartet filled the air with soft music that was supposed to celebrate love. Every centerpiece had been measured twice. Every champagne glass stood exactly 1 inch apart. Every place card rested perfectly on imported linen because Sophia believed details mattered, even when no one noticed them. She adjusted one final napkin before allowing herself a quiet breath. The ceremony had ended without delays. The flowers had arrived fresh despite unexpected traffic on Lakeshore Drive. The photographer had recovered from a forgotten memory card, and the bride had never learned how many tiny disasters had already been solved before she smiled for the cameras. That was what wedding planners did. If they were successful, nobody realized they had saved the day. Sophia glanced toward the sweetheart table to confirm the seating chart one last time, when a sharp female voice sliced cleanly through the music. "Excuse me, that chair isn't for staff." Several nearby conversations faded as heads slowly turned. Sophia looked toward the elegantly dressed bridesmaid who had spoken. "I'm sorry," she asked with her usual calm smile. "The coordinator reserved this chair for me while I finished updating the reception timeline." The bridesmaid laughed softly before placing one manicured hand on the back of the chair. "No," she said loudly enough for surrounding guests to hear. "This seat belongs to beautiful people in the wedding party, not the help." Without another word, she dragged the chair away across the polished floor, the scraping sound echoing through the ballroom louder than the quartet itself. A few guests exchanged awkward looks. Others smiled behind expensive wine glasses. One man lowered his eyes. Another whispered something that made the couple beside him chuckle. Sophia remained standing, her clipboard held neatly against her navy blue dress, forcing herself to keep her shoulders straight even as heat crept into her face. She had learned years ago that humiliation only grew larger when someone argued with it. Across the room, the groom's mother noticed the scene and walked over wearing a flawless smile that never reached her eyes. "Honestly," she sighed dramatically, "someone really should remind vendors where they belong." More laughter followed, quieter this time, but somehow even more painful because nobody stopped it. Sophia lowered her gaze for one brief second, swallowed the knot forming in her throat, and simply answered, "Of course, ma'am. I'll continue working." She stepped away from the table before anyone could see how tightly she was gripping her clipboard. She reminded herself that the evening was almost over, that professionalism mattered more than pride, and that tomorrow none of these people would remember her name. What she didn't know was that someone already had. Near the grand entrance, the ballroom doors opened without fanfare. Conversation slowed almost instinctively. Several security professionals straightened at once. A tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit entered with measured steps, his expression calm enough to silence the room without a single word. Damian Moretti had arrived exactly on schedule for the business partnership reception following the ceremony, but the first thing he noticed was not the bride, the groom, or the $1 million celebration his company had sponsored. It was the woman quietly walking away from an empty space where a chair had just been taken from her, still carrying herself with grace, while an entire ballroom watched her stand alone. Damian Moretti did not move immediately. He remained near the entrance with one hand resting lightly against the polished handle of the ballroom door while the conversations around him slowly resumed, as though the room had already decided the uncomfortable moment no longer deserved attention. His chief of security, Lucas Hayes, leaned slightly closer. "Sir, the bride and groom are waiting for you." Damian did not answer. His eyes followed Sophia Bennett instead. She never looked back at the table where her chair had been taken. She simply crossed the ballroom carrying her clipboard with the same steady pace she had used all afternoon, stopping beside a florist whose centerpiece leaned half an inch too far to the left. Without hesitation, she adjusted the arrangement, straightened a folded menu, thanked the young assistant arranging candles, and quietly continued toward the kitchen entrance. Nothing about her movements suggested anger. Nothing suggested humiliation. Yet somehow that made the entire scene feel heavier. Most people fought when they were embarrassed. Some cried. Others argued until someone apologized. Sophia did none of those things. She simply kept making sure everyone else's evening remained perfect while pretending her own dignity had not been left behind beside an empty place setting. Damian had spent most of his adult life reading people before they spoke. In his world, survival depended on recognizing fear hidden behind confidence and dishonesty hidden behind charm. Tonight, he saw something different. Restraint. The kind earned only after being disappointed too many times. As he slowly walked farther into the ballroom, guests greeted him with practiced smiles, eager handshakes, and polite compliments about his company's sponsorship of the wedding. He acknowledged them with brief nods, but remembered almost none of their names. Instead, he noticed smaller things. A waiter carrying 3 heavy serving trays nearly stumbled near the dance floor. Before anyone else reacted, Sophia reached him, steadied one tray with a careful hand, smiled reassuringly, and whispered something that made the nervous young man relax. Moments later, she noticed an elderly guest struggling with her chair and quietly helped reposition it before disappearing again without waiting for thanks. Near the dessert station, a little flower girl accidentally dropped her ribbon basket. White petals scattered across the marble floor. Several adults stepped around the mess without slowing down. Sophia knelt immediately, gathered every petal with the little girl, brushed invisible dust from the child's dress, and tucked one loose curl gently behind the girl's ear before sending her back with an encouraging smile. Damian watched every moment in complete silence. "Do you know her?" he finally asked. Lucas glanced across the room before answering. Sophia Bennett, independent wedding planner, one of the highest-rated coordinators in the city. She has managed nearly every major charity gala we have sponsored during the last year. Damian continued watching. "Has she always worked alone?" Lucas nodded. "Almost always. Vendors ask for her by name. Clients request her months in advance." Damian looked toward the crowded reception tables where laughter had fully returned. The bridesmaid who had removed the chair was posing for photographs, while the groom's mother accepted compliments as though nothing unusual had happened. Neither woman spared Sophia another glance. Damian found that detail strangely unsettling. Cruelty was easy to recognize. Indifference required practice. Across the ballroom, Sophia quietly checked the reception schedule one more time before accepting a bottle of water from a teenage assistant. She thanked him first instead of simply taking it. Then, after making certain everyone else had already been served dinner, she twisted the cap open but never raised it to her lips because another guest waved impatiently from across the room. She closed the bottle again without complaint, smiled with the same calm professionalism, and walked away before taking a single sip. Damian watched the unopened bottle remain forgotten on a nearby service table, and for reasons he could not yet explain, it bothered him far more than the missing chair. Sophia Bennett had never imagined that the hardest part of planning weddings would have nothing to do with flowers, budgets, or impossible schedules. It would be convincing people that kindness was not determined by the number stitched inside a dress. 12 years earlier, she had graduated from a small hospitality program outside Milwaukee with 2 suitcases, $800 in savings, and a notebook. Filled with sketches of reception layouts, she hoped to bring to life one day. Her first job paid barely enough to cover rent in a tiny apartment, but every evening she stayed after everyone else left, folding napkins, polishing candle holders, learning how lighting changed photographs, and memorizing the names of every vendor, because she believed people deserved to be remembered. Success came slowly. One satisfied couple recommended her to another, then another, until her calendar filled almost a year in advance. Brides trusted her because she listened more than she spoke. Grooms trusted her because she solved problems before they became emergencies. Florists loved her because she defended their work. Bakers appreciated that she always carried extra cooling supplies in her SUV during hot Illinois summers. Photographers admired that she somehow knew exactly when every emotional moment would happen. 3 years earlier, everything changed after she developed a thyroid condition that altered her metabolism despite careful eating habits and long workdays spent constantly moving. The scale climbed month after month, no matter how disciplined she remained. Friends who once invited her everywhere slowly stopped calling. A boutique owner politely suggested she consider shopping somewhere with more generous sizing. One former client recognized her outside a grocery store, smiled warmly, then hesitated before asking, "You are still the wedding planner, right?" As though confidence and talent disappeared with a changing waistline. Sophia cried exactly once after hearing that question. She promised herself it would also be the last time. Since then, she had decided that every ounce of energy wasted proving her worth would be better spent creating unforgettable weddings for people who might never know the quiet sacrifices behind each perfect celebration. She never argued with rude remarks. She simply worked harder. She never posted emotional messages online asking for sympathy. She simply arrived before sunrise and left after midnight. She never expected applause because she believed excellence eventually spoke louder than appearances. Almost everyone saw only the finished ballroom. Nobody noticed the woman carrying folding chairs through loading docks at 6 in the morning or replacing damaged linens herself when suppliers arrived late. Nobody knew she quietly paid overtime wages for temporary assistance whenever a client's budget unexpectedly collapsed. Tonight was no different. Even after the humiliation she had just endured, she was still calculating the timing between dinner service and the first dance while confirming the musicians had enough bottled water backstage. Across the ballroom, Damian Moretti accepted congratulations from business leaders who praised his generosity for sponsoring the reception, but fragments of Lucas's earlier report lingered in his thoughts. Highest-rated coordinator. Requested months in advance. Works almost entirely on referrals. He watched Sophia kneel beside an elderly violinist whose music stand had become loose. She tightened the adjustment knob herself, smiled after confirming it was secure, and quietly stepped away before the grateful musician could even finish saying thank you. Damian found himself wondering how someone capable of making hundreds of strangers feel comfortable could spend an entire evening surrounded by people who had not offered her a single place to sit. For the first time since entering the ballroom, he stopped listening to the conversations around him altogether, because the woman everyone else treated as invisible had somehow become the only person in the room he could truly see. The reception settled into an easy rhythm that looked effortless to every guest and exhausted every person working behind the scenes. Servers moved between tables carrying polished silver trays. The quartet shifted into softer melodies, and laughter rose beneath the sparkling chandeliers, as if the evening had always been destined to unfold this perfectly. Damian Moretti accepted another handshake from a city councilman, listened to a business proposal he had no interest in hearing, then excused himself with quiet courtesy. Instead of joining the bride and groom at the head table, he walked slowly around the perimeter of the ballroom where almost no one expected to find him. Lucas followed, at a respectful distance, saying nothing. Damian preferred silence when he was thinking. He stopped near the service corridor just in time to see Sophia speaking with a young catering assistant whose hands were trembling while balancing a tray of coffee cups. The teenager apologized repeatedly for nearly spilling one earlier. Sophia smiled with genuine warmth. "Everyone has a first difficult event," she said gently. "The guests will remember how you treated them far longer than they remember whether the coffee arrived 30 seconds late." The young man laughed nervously before standing a little straighter. Damian noticed something unusual. She encouraged people without making herself the center of the conversation. A few moments later, one of the photographers hurried toward her with concern written across his face. "Sophia," the projector stopped responding. "The family slideshow begins in 12 minutes. She did not panic. She simply nodded. "Give me 5. She disappeared behind the stage, returned carrying a different cable from an emergency supply case, connected everything herself, tested the presentation twice, and quietly thanked the photographer for noticing the issue before the guests did. No applause followed. No one even realized there had almost been a problem. Damian glanced toward Lucas. "How many events has she coordinated for us?" Lucas answered immediately. 9 charity galas, for fundraising dinners, 2 scholarship ceremonies, and now this reception. Any complaints? Lucas shook his head. None from clients. The only reports in our files involve her solving problems that other vendors created. Damian remained silent. His attention returned to Sophia as she crossed the ballroom once again, finally reaching the unopened bottle of water she had left behind earlier. She picked it up, twisted the cap halfway, then stopped before taking a drink because another vendor hurried over carrying a worried expression. Sophia, one of the children accidentally smudged frosting on the display cake. She closed the bottle again without hesitation. Show me. 5 minutes later, the cake looked untouched. The child was smiling instead of crying. The parents looked relieved. Sophia quietly washed the frosting from her hands and returned to updating the evening timeline. She still had not eaten. Damian checked his watch. Nearly 3 hours had passed since he arrived. The dinner service was almost complete, yet every time Sophia had the chance to rest, someone else needed her first. Then another detail caught his attention. Staff members thanked her naturally. The florist hugged her before leaving. The musicians waved as they packed away extra equipment. The valet attendant smiled when she asked whether he had managed to eat dinner. Every employee seemed genuinely happy to see her. Yet the guests who enjoyed the flawless celebration rarely looked directly at her unless they wanted something. Damian had spent years building successful companies by trusting patterns instead of first impressions. Patterns never lied. Tonight he saw one clearly. The people who worked beside Sophia respected her. The people who judged her appearance underestimated her. As he watched her disappear into the kitchen once again, carrying someone else's problem instead of her own, Damian quietly reached a conclusion that made the evening feel very different from the one he had expected to attend. As the evening moved toward the first dance, the ballroom appeared flawless to every guest, but behind the polished smiles and glowing candles, tension quietly gathered where few people bothered to look. Sophia stepped into the service hallway to review the final timeline when she heard hurried footsteps approaching. Emily, one of the youngest event assistants, stopped in front of her, visibly anxious. Sophia, I think you should know something. Sophia lowered her clipboard. What happened? Emily glanced over her shoulder before speaking more softly. The bride's mother has been telling everyone that the reception schedule is falling apart because you cannot keep up. Sophia frowned slightly. Nothing is behind schedule. I know, Emily replied. Everything has actually been early. But she keeps saying you have been distracted all afternoon. Before Sophia could answer, another coordinator hurried over carrying a printed seating chart. Someone moved 6 place cards again, he said. The grandparents are suddenly assigned to different tables. Sophia immediately studied the chart. Her eyes narrowed for only a second before she calmly shook her head. These are not my revisions. The original version was approved yesterday. She quickly restored every guest to the correct table from memory without checking a computer. The coordinator stared at her in amazement. You memorized all 148 guests. Sophia smiled politely. Names matter. She handed back the corrected chart and returned to work. Neither she nor the staff noticed Damian standing just beyond the hallway entrance, quietly observing everything without interrupting. Lucas approached beside him. Sir, I spoke with the venue manager. Damian looked toward him, and the seating chart was changed twice after Sophia approved it. Security footage shows one of the bridesmaids making the adjustments about 30 minutes before guests arrived. Damian remained expressionless. Who instructed her? Lucas hesitated. The groom's mother. Damian said nothing. Minutes later, another small disturbance unfolded near the dessert display. A guest complained loudly that the signature cake leaned to one side and blamed the event staff for careless work. Before Sophia even reached the table, the pastry chef stepped forward. That is not true, he said firmly. Miss Bennett corrected the display earlier. Someone moved it after she left. Several nearby vendors exchanged knowing glances but remained professionally silent. Sophia thanked the chef with a grateful nod before carefully straightening the display once more. She never defended herself. She simply fixed the problem again. Damian noticed a pattern becoming impossible to ignore. Every issue somehow led back to Sophia, yet every solution also came from Sophia. Every accusation collapsed the moment someone who actually worked beside her spoke up. Lucas quietly added, I also checked the reception planning records. Every additional expense tonight that exceeded the original budget was personally covered by Miss Bennett 3 weeks ago, after one supplier canceled unexpectedly. She never billed the family. Damian slowly turned toward him. Did the bride know? According to the invoices, no. Damian's gaze returned to Sophia, just as she bent down to help the little flower girl retie one loose satin ribbon before sending her back to her parents with another reassuring smile. She had spent the entire evening repairing mistakes she had not created while protecting the happiness of people who barely acknowledged her existence. Then, from across the ballroom, the groom's mother raised her voice once again. Where is that planner now? If anything else goes wrong tonight, everyone will know exactly who is responsible. Several guests nodded without questioning the statement. Sophia heard every word but continued walking toward the stage with calm determination, unaware that Damian had heard them as well, and for the first time since entering the ballroom, the quiet patience in his eyes began to give way to unmistakable resolve. The first dance had not even begun when another ripple of uneasiness spread through the ballroom. The master of ceremonies checked his watch twice. The musicians quietly adjusted their instruments, and the photographer looked toward the stage with growing concern. Sophia immediately noticed that the custom slideshow prepared for the couple had disappeared from the presentation system. She walked briskly to the technician's table without raising her voice. "When did the file disappear?" she asked. The young technician looked flustered. "It was here 15 minutes ago. I swear I did not delete it." Sophia placed a reassuring hand on the edge of the table. "Take a deep breath. We will solve it." She opened the backup drive she always carried for emergencies and began restoring the presentation. Before the progress bar reached halfway, the groom's mother strode across the ballroom, attracting the attention of nearby guests with every deliberate step. "There you are," she announced loudly. "Another mistake. This reception has been one disappointment after another." Conversations faded as dozens of guests turned toward the exchange. Sophia remained composed. "The slideshow is already being restored. It will be ready before the first dance begins." The older woman folded her arms. "There always seems to be an excuse." Several members of the wedding party gathered nearby. The same bridesmaid who had taken Sophia's chair earlier smirked before adding, "Maybe this event needed someone who could actually handle a luxury wedding." A few uncomfortable laughs drifted through the room. Sophia looked from one face to another before answering quietly, "Every scheduled event is still on time. Your guests have not experienced any delays." "Do not lecture me," the groom's mother replied sharply. "You work for us." The words settled heavily across the ballroom. Staff members exchanged uneasy glances but remained silent. Emily lowered her eyes. The pastry chef clenched his jaw. Even the musicians stopped speaking among themselves. Sophia inhaled slowly before answering with remarkable restraint. "I am here to make sure your family's celebration is successful. That has always been my priority." Instead of calming the situation, her professionalism seemed to frustrate the older woman even more. "Then perhaps you should stop pretending you belong with the guests and remember your place." She pointed toward the service corridor. "Stand with the staff until the reception is over. That is where you belong." Silence swept across the ballroom. No one moved. Sophia felt dozens of eyes fixed upon her, waiting to see whether she would argue. She did not. She simply lowered her clipboard, nodded once, and answered with quiet dignity. "If that will help your evening continue peacefully, I will do exactly that." She turned to leave, her expression controlled despite the unmistakable sadness in her eyes. At that precise moment, Damian Moretti stepped away from the group of executives who had been speaking with him. His measured footsteps echoed across the polished floor, calm enough to command attention without demanding it. Lucas and the security team remained several feet behind, saying nothing. Damian did not hurry. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked directly toward the empty space where Sophia had been standing. Every conversation stopped. The quartet lowered their instruments. Even the photographers instinctively lowered their cameras. Sophia paused as she realized someone had stepped into her path. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet Damian's steady gaze for the first time that evening. Without speaking a single word, he looked briefly at the empty chair beside the head table, then back at Sophia, as though he had finally decided exactly what he was about to do. Damian Moretti stopped beside Sophia without looking at anyone else in the room. The silence became so complete that even the soft hum of the ballroom air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Sophia lowered her eyes respectfully. "Mr. Moretti, I apologize for the interruption. We will begin the first dance in less than 3 minutes." Damian studied her calm expression for a brief moment before speaking in a voice that carried effortlessly through the ballroom. "You are apologizing for a problem you did not create." The words landed with quiet force. The groom's mother forced a polite smile. "Mr. Moretti, there has simply been a misunderstanding. We were only reminding the event staff where they should be during the reception." Damian finally turned toward her. His expression remained composed, but there was no warmth behind it. I have spent the last 3 hours watching this reception. No one interrupted him. I watched Miss Bennett solve problems before your guests ever noticed them. I watched her help your vendors, encourage your staff, comfort your youngest guests, and protect the reputation of this celebration over and over again. His eyes moved slowly across the ballroom. I also watched people who contributed nothing speak to her, as though kindness were optional. The bridesmaid folded her arms, attempting a nervous laugh. We were only joking. Damian answered immediately. Respect is never a joke to the person being denied it. The smile disappeared from her face. He stepped toward the head table where the chair beside the bride remained empty, reserved for an executive who had canceled earlier that afternoon. Without asking anyone for permission, Damian rested one hand on the elegant chair and pulled it away from the table. The sound of its legs gliding across the polished floor echoed through the silent ballroom just as loudly as the chair that had been taken from Sophia hours before. He carried it across the room himself until he stood beside her once again. Then he placed it carefully on the floor. Miss Bennett, he said with complete sincerity, please have a seat. Sophia blinked in surprise. Sir, I cannot. I am working. You have been working since before most people in this room arrived, Damian replied. You have earned 5 minutes. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. I appreciate your kindness, but this evening belongs to the bride and groom. Damian gave a small nod. Exactly. And because of your work, they have enjoyed a beautiful celebration. He stepped slightly aside and gestured toward the chair. Please. The ballroom remained motionless. The pastry chef smiled quietly from across the room. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. Several servers exchanged relieved glances. Sophia slowly sat down, still holding her clipboard on her lap, as though she might need to stand again at any moment. Damian looked toward one of the catering managers. Has Miss Bennett eaten dinner? The manager answered honestly. No, sir. She has not had the opportunity. Damian nodded once. Then I believe that should be corrected immediately. Within seconds, 2 servers approached with a freshly prepared dinner plate and the unopened bottle of water Sophia had set aside hours earlier. She looked at them with visible surprise. Thank you, she whispered. Damian turned back toward the gathered guests, his voice remaining calm but unmistakably firm. A successful celebration is never created by appearances alone. It is created by people whose dedication often goes unnoticed. Tonight, I think we have overlooked the wrong person for far too long. No one laughed. No one looked away. For the first time that evening, the room that had watched Sophia stand alone now watched her being treated with the respect she had quietly earned all along. Sophia looked down at the warm dinner plate resting before her, as though she had forgotten what it felt like to be invited instead of tolerated. Around the ballroom, the silence gradually gave way to uneasy whispers. Guests who had laughed earlier now avoided meeting one another's eyes. The bride shifted nervously in her chair before finally standing. Mr. Moretti, she said carefully, if there has been some misunderstanding, I would like the chance to make it right. Damian turned toward her with the same composed expression that had never once given way to anger. Then the truth deserves to arrive before any apology. He glanced toward Lucas, who stepped forward holding a small tablet connected to the ballroom presentation system. Within seconds, the large projection screen behind the dance floor came to life. Several guests assumed the wedding slideshow had finally begun, but instead they saw security footage recorded throughout the afternoon. The first clip showed the bridesmaid quietly removing 6 place cards from their assigned tables and replacing them while no staff members were present. A timestamp confirmed Sophia had already left the room before the changes were made. Another recording appeared. The groom's mother was seen directing 2 assistants to move the reserved chair away from the reception table moments before guests entered the ballroom. The next clip showed Sophia calmly restoring the seating chart exactly as originally approved while several staff members watched. Another recording revealed the dessert display being repositioned after Sophia had already corrected it. Each accusation that had been directed toward her dissolved before the eyes of every guest. No dramatic music accompanied the footage. No one raised a voice. The quiet truth proved more powerful than any argument. The groom slowly covered his face with one hand before looking towards Sophia with visible regret. You tried to protect our wedding all day, he said softly. And we never even asked what was really happening. The The bride's eyes filled with tears as she stepped closer. You paid for extra flowers when our supplier canceled, did not you? Sophia hesitated before answering honestly. I did not want you to worry on your wedding day. And the transportation delay? The bride continued. Sophia smiled gently. It was resolved. The replacement musicians? Also resolved. The bride shook her head in disbelief. You fixed everything. Before Sophia could respond, the pastry chef spoke from across the ballroom. She always does. The florist nodded immediately. She covered part of my delivery costs during a snowstorm last winter because she refused to let a bride lose her dream ceremony. One after another, vendors began sharing stories the guests had never heard. The photographer described how Sophia had once spent an entire night rebuilding a wedding album after a printing company made an expensive mistake. The catering manager explained that she regularly stayed until every temporary employee had transportation home before leaving herself. Emily quietly added, she remembers every assistant's birthday. Every sentence revealed another layer of the woman who had quietly carried everyone else's burdens without expecting recognition. Damian listened without interruption before finally speaking once more. Character is revealed most clearly by those who have nothing to gain from praising someone. His eyes swept across the room. Tonight, every person who actually worked beside Miss Bennet told exactly the same story. The ballroom remained silent, but it was no longer the uncomfortable silence of judgment. It had become the thoughtful silence of people realizing they had measured someone by appearance while overlooking every meaningful quality that truly defined her. Sophia lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by attention she had never sought. She had arrived hoping only to deliver a perfect wedding. She never imagined that the people who knew her best would become the voices that finally allowed everyone else to see the person she had quietly been all along. 1 month later, the autumn sunlight poured through the tall windows of a newly renovated studio overlooking the Chicago River. Fresh flowers lined the entrance, elegant sketches covered one wall, and a simple brass plaque beside the front door read, Bennett's Signature Events. Sophia stood quietly in the middle of the office before the first client meeting of the day, taking in every detail she had dreamed about for years. The journey had not begun with investors or grand announcements. It had begun with something much smaller. 3 days after the wedding reception, nearly every vendor who had worked beside her that evening called with the same offer. The florist volunteered exclusive seasonal pricing. The pastry chef promised priority scheduling. The photographer recommended her to every engaged couple on his waiting list. The musicians offered discounted performances for her first year in business. Word spread faster than any advertising campaign could have managed. Not because people remembered the uncomfortable moment at the reception, but because they remembered what happened afterward. They remembered seeing quiet professionalism recognized at last. They remembered discovering that true excellence often worked behind the scenes without asking for applause. More couples began requesting Sophia by name than ever before. Brides told their friends they wanted someone who cared more about people than perfection. Grooms appreciated her honesty and calm confidence. Parents trusted her because she always treated every member of the family with patience, even during stressful moments. Across the city, her calendar steadily filled with celebrations built on something more meaningful than luxury. They were built on trust. That Thursday morning, Emily walked into the office carrying 2 coffee cups and laughed. You are officially booked every weekend through next spring. Sophia smiled with quiet disbelief. That still feels impossible. Emily shook her head. No, it feels earned. Before Sophia could answer, the receptionist stepped into the office. Your 10 o'clock appointment is here. Sophia straightened a stack of design samples and walked into the meeting room expecting another engaged couple. Instead, Damian Moretti stood beside the conference table holding a single cream-colored folder. He smiled gently, the reserved expression she remembered from the reception now softened by genuine warmth. Good morning, Miss Bennet. She returned the smile. Good morning, Mr. Moretti. I was not expecting to see you. Neither was my assistant, he admitted with a quiet laugh. I insisted on making this appointment myself. He placed the folder on the table and slid it toward her. Sophia opened it carefully. Inside was a planning agreement with every page already completed except one blank line waiting for her signature. She looked up with puzzled curiosity. You would like to sponsor another charity gala? Damian slowly shook his head. No. She looked at the paperwork again before reading the event title printed across the first page. A small smile appeared before she could stop it. Wedding planning consultation. Damian nodded. For my own wedding. Sophia blinked in surprise. Congratulations. He met her eyes with calm sincerity. I have not proposed yet. She laughed softly. Then why are you planning a wedding already? His answer came without hesitation. Because I spent an entire evening watching the kind of woman who quietly made everyone else's happiest day possible, even when no one thanked her, and I realized that if I were fortunate enough to build a future with someone, I would want it to begin with that same kindness. Sophia felt tears gather, not from sadness this time, but from the quiet realization that the most meaningful moments often arrived without warning. She extended her hand across the table. Damian accepted it with gentle respect. Outside the office window, the city continued its busy rhythm, unaware that two lives had just taken their first step toward a future built not on appearances, but on compassion, dignity, and the simple truth that the people who choose kindness when no one is watching are often the ones most deserving of love when everyone finally sees them.